did I? That's good, right? All right, here we go. Oh, somebody put a kitten in there. That looks pretty cute. I think cats look really cute. No offense, I've had a couple in my house, and maybe they weren't the most exciting cats. And my niece lived with me for a while and brought two cats and a dog. That's a lot of animals in one house. All right, but we're not here to talk about my niece or two cats and one dog. We're here to talk about US history. So let's talk about a couple of things. We're getting close to the end of class, which is tragic. I know you guys are sad. It's like we don't ever want it to end, but it has to end at some point because you have other classes. So I just looked up the what's the last day I can drop date, and that is April 26th. So that's coming up pretty soon. Oh my gosh, you're not supposed to say that in the chat. I sent an email announcement sort of thing yesterday. I really need you to turn stuff in. There's a bunch of you. It's like, I really mean to get my stuff in, and it's hard with COVID and I know it's hard with COVID and pandemic. That's why I'm taking stuff late. But couple things. One, that in a normal situation without COVID and pandemic, nobody's going to give you as much slack as we're giving you right now. You know that. I know you know that. So you gotta, yeah. Okay. So don't expect this next semester from anybody ever again. And then two, my grades are due. So turn in your stuff. I cannot wait forever for your stuff. So I put some deadlines in there, turn in the stuff on time. I won't take the book review late because you've known since the first day of class about the book review. So, you could have put it off for months and still have it done. So book review, you got to turn in on time, no exceptions. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to tell you. No, everything else I've told you. If you're in the habit of turning stuff in 2 weeks late, you can't do that anymore because we're at the end of class. We don't have time for that. We only have the last 3 chapters. Okay, let me check that. Okay, it's mostly about not failing people. And I'm also getting emails like, do you have to require the book review? Yeah, I do. My boss kind of thinks I do. So for those of you emailing saying like, does that really have to happen for an A? It really does, okay? I don't think there are 50. Let's see, how's the final grade 300? Because I said it is. I don't understand that question. I thought I explained that in the announcement because that's what I say it is. I don't understand what you're asking me. I'm counting 3. No, the book review is 20. The book review is 20. Yeah. Okay. And there was a possibility. Yeah. It's guys. It's posted. There's a rubric. Yeah. There's 3 more questions. Whatever points are left are going to get your total to 300. The book review is extra. So yeah, there's a test. Yeah. I really have done this before. I really have. I've done this for 18 years. And I've done the grading thing for 32. I promise you, I know what's going on the grades. So you take care of your part. I'll take care of mine. I promise. I promise. Okay. That's why they pay me so much. And also, if you've turned something in and you have a concern about how it was graded, you think it was unfair, feel free to email me and I will pay more attention to emails over the next day or so. It's not really that you get to miss 50 points to get an A. It's because you're not guaranteed any, like, your book review. Yeah, your book review is 20 possible points. There was an optional assignment that not very many of you opted to do, which is fine because it was optional. So that's cool. But all those things are essentially extra points. So you have the 300 points possible, and then you have some additional points that you could earn. I will tell you that I'm usually a little stingy on the book review points, but it's pretty rare for anybody to get 20. But as long as you read the book and follow the directions, you're going to get at least 10. I mean, that is pretty much the truth. let's look. Let me see if I can open the book review. Oh, excuse me for the big yawn. Goodness. All right, book review. I know you can't see it. I'm sorry. Let's talk about the book review for a minute or two, because the biggest problem on the book review typically is that people don't follow instructions. Well, there's two big problems. Okay, so if you, I, I thought that I put in the announcement. I may have put the grade total wrong though. I need to go back and check because it's 30 points for each different grade. So 270 for an A, 240. Sorry for the yawn. For a B, and 210 for a C. Below 210, you're not going to be happy, I know. And very rarely does a D transfer anywhere. Yeah, it's pretty rare. I think I had one student once that somehow talked their college into it, but I don't know how they did that. Okay, let's look at the book review. All right. All right. What are you, dang it. Let me talk about the book review, and then you can ask me your how come I'm not getting an A question. All right. Kids, goodness. All right. So book review, 1,500 words is about 4 to 5 pages. So it's not huge, in my opinion. And that's kind of double spaced, 10 to 12 point normal font that isn't script. And don't write in any flippin' red font. All right. I don't want to read any more red font. That's not cool. Okay. It's not funny. Cut it out. All right. So 1,500. What's up with you? 1,500 words, 4 to 5 pages. All you really have to do, one, don't cheat. Oh my gosh, don't cheat. Every semester, one student out of all my classes, one student will always just copy the dang book review from some online source. Like I would never know that you've suddenly became a professional historian and you just plop it in there. Don't do that, okay? Because then you get an F for the entire class, not the assignment, the entire class. So don't cheat, okay? Optional assignment, you don't have to do it. So dang it, don't cheat, okay? You got it? All right, thing number 2, follow the instructions. It's not a book report, it's a book review. So you're not telling me everything that happened in the book. You're doing these 3 things. See, part 1, part 2, and part 3. You can even label it part 1, part 2, and part 3. Don't do that in your English class, but you can do that for me. I don't care. Just make sure you actually have part 1, part 2, and part 3 in there. So part 1 is the short part, couple paragraphs, page and a half, where you tell me what happened in the book and kind of go in order. Like, you know, the first 5 chapters, they talk about Teddy Roosevelt's childhood and where he grew up in New York and how he had asthma and he liked birds and, you know, whatever. And then the next 4 or 5 chapters, they talk about Teddy Roosevelt's formal education, how he went to Harvard, how he met his wife, how he liked to go yachting, whatever. Okay, and then the last 6 chapters were about Roosevelt's presidency. So you just give me kind of a general outline about like that. And then the second part, you say, why did the author write the book? What was the author's thesis? What's the author trying to prove? That sort of thing. This is why it's much more useful for you to read a history book rather than a novel. Every once in a while, I have a student that wants to read a novel. That works sometimes, like The Jungle. That would work because I know one of you already asked about that. That'll work. You just have to remember you're talking about thesis, which is more than just meat packing plants are gross. And you're also talking about setting. Is the setting accurate to the time period? And The Jungle's easy in some ways because some legislation comes about it and every history book mentions it. We've talked about it. So, okay. So author's thesis, why the person, I'm Midwestern still in language. So guy is male, female, however anyone identifies. To me is a guy, person. So why did the person write the book? Do you think that they achieved their purpose? And some quotes from the book, not like 6 sentences or anything, but a sentence or half a sentence or a little phrase or something like that. If you can't figure out why the person wrote the book, which can happen, I'm not judging at all, look in the foreword or the introduction, because usually a historian, they're not always great writers, although Dr. Foner, good writer, usually a historian will say in their book, my thesis is, They just want to make sure you get it. So look in the foreword or the intro. And if you can't tell what the thesis is, I got to keep looking. They had to have a reason to write the book, right? So talk about what the thesis was and show examples throughout the book, whether they prove the thesis or not. If every single one of your examples comes in the first 20 pages, I'm going to think they read the first 20 pages and not the rest of the book. If they all come from the first 10 and the last 10, I'm going to think they read the beginning and the end and not the middle. So quotes throughout the book, okay? And then that's about 2 pages. And then part 3 is also about 2 pages. And this is what you thought of the book. How did it compare to stuff you already knew? How did it compare to stuff from the textbook? And even if you don't think there's anything in the textbook that is like what you wrote about, talk at least about what the book says about the era that your book is from, and things that you maybe think might have improved the book. Don't say stuff like the book was boring, even if you think it was, because that's not an academic assessment. So you can say, if they'd included more about this and less about this, I think it might have been easier to read, or the author's vocabulary really inhibits enjoyment of the reading or makes it hard to understand, that sort of stuff. Certainly there are historians who occasionally look like they're practicing for the SAT or something. It's not as common, but it does happen from time to time. And you could also talk about if you think there are any biases that are present. You know that everyone has biases. It just may not be that you're aware of theirs, and you don't have to be. I mean, talk about it if you notice. Or like there was one year a whole bunch of students from Westwood were all wanting to read the same book about FDR as an environmentalist. I can't remember what the name of the book was, but it's because their English teacher told them they had to read the book over the summer. It was a summer class. They thought, oh, well, 2 birds, 1 stone, that sort of thing. And I told him, I said, I think you're going to have a problem with this because the guy who's writing the book is the New York Times environmental reporter. He's not a historian. So you're going to have to critique his knowledge of history while you read the book, and you don't have enough knowledge of history to know what's wrong with his knowledge of history, because his book's not a history book. It's an environmental book. And they didn't believe me, and they got really bad grades, which was really hard on kids. I don't know what goes on at Westwood, but it was really distressing for kids to get lower grades. All right. So quotes and parts of the book in there, page numbers. You don't have to do any formal MLA or Chicago Manual of Style or Turabian, which is what history professors prefer. By the way, we don't like MLA. But for this, because I know when you're quoting, it's from the book you're reading, just put a page number. And then when you say in the textbook, it says this, just put a page number because you just said in the textbook. So that part of this can be pretty informal. There's some of you who pretty consistently misspell words, and believe me, we all learn differently. And I understand if this is kind of a function of dyslexia or something like that, run the spell check, okay? Run the spell check, or let someone else read it who's a little more skilled, has different skills than you. Believe me, clearly we all learn differently. I have different academic skills than lots of other folks. Not everyone appreciates mine either. So not saying anything except let someone else help you edit it. And that's just kind of the way life goes. We all have someone else that helps us with stuff that's not our skill. And we all have different skills. So the fact that dyslexia keeps you from spelling doesn't mean it doesn't keep you from memorizing, because, we all get different skills. So, all right, it'll give you a grade that either says yes or no, essentially. And you'll know that it's a yes if you get some points. It's a no if you get a 0. The only reason for 0 would be if you plagiarized, or if I have no idea whether you read that book or not. Okay. And then we have the book list, but you could also pick something not from the book list. And then the rubric. This is why I was irritated with you for not knowing how many points a book review is worth. It's in the grade book, rubric, it's in the course documents, it's in the syllabus. Don't you kids read stuff? So here we go. So 20 points. And you do have a little section about, is it written well? So make sure it's written well. All right. Did I yell enough about that? How was that? Was it good? Okay. All right. Let's see what you guys say. All right. I shouldn't have made the little jokes about Westwood. So apologies if you're from Westwood. Those kids were a little intense. I also taught one class completely from Lake Travis, and all I'll say is I'll never teach another class completely from Lake Travis. Yeah. And no offense if you're from there, because you're probably lovely. I just had a, okay. So review. I don't know what you guys are talking about here. So each weekly question is worth 10 points. And then whatever's left, whether it's 30 or 40, that's how much the last quiz will be. So the total of all your weekly questions and quizzes will be 300, okay? Does that make sense? And then you've got like the 20 with the book review that kind of goes on the top because you don't have to do the book review. And then you have that 10 for the extra credit or optional assignment, which you didn't have to do either. Okay, so 300 basic points, and whatever your grade is based on the 300. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Just concentrate on earning the points. Think about that. All right, let's look at weekly questions. Today's weekly question is probably going to be covered a little more next time than today because this is kind of a 70s and 80s question, and Reagan is definitely more the 80s. So analyze the successes of Reagan's administration, both domestic and foreign policy. Explain why he left office popular with the public despite leaving behind enormous national debt, which is funny now because not even close to what we have now, and no one even cares anymore, which is fascinating to me as a person from my era, because we were concerned about Reagan's national debt because it was several billion dollars, it's like $20 billion. And now that was like Tuesday's debt. So times are strange. For this question, honestly, for any question, one of the first things you got to look at is how do I organize my answer? This is also a thing that several of you are really not improving on. And I don't say that to be unkind to you. I say that to just mention that as you move forward in your college career, you have to improve on this stuff. You just do. Okay. So anytime you write an answer to a question, there needs to be an obvious organizational strategy. So you got to think about that first before you answer the question. Of course, the bonus with these is you already know the question. So I would, general statement like Reagan's administration seemed to have many successes, failures, whatever. Have one paragraph about domestic policy and one paragraph about foreign policy where you talk about successes and failures. Or you could have one paragraph about successes where you talk about domestic policy and foreign policy. And you could have one paragraph about failures where you talk about domestic policy and foreign policy. Just have a consistent organizational strategy. Either one is good. And always, 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 I know I keep saying this, go in chronological order. Talk about things in the order in which they happen. This matters so much to history teachers. And when you mention an event, like, I don't know, Iran-Contra scandal or something, just put in parentheses 2000, what year is that? 2006, probably. I don't know what year it was, but it was definitely not 2006 and 1986 or something. Sorry. Wow. Okay. But just put the date in parentheses. So that way it'll help remind you if you're going in chronological order as well. And chronological order matters so much to history teachers because it tends to show cause and effect or change over time, which are two major historical themes that every historian wants you to pay attention. All right, and then you've got a question about Bush and then a question about Obama and Trump. So it's exciting that you get to talk about Trump. Good. Oh my goodness, this allergy season just about the end of me. All right, so let's look at the notes. Do you guys have any questions? I know you had a lot of stuff in the chat, but it was mostly about grades and stuff. Do you have any other questions that did not get answered before we start talking about the stuff? Prod, my doctor's calling me. We're going to ignore her, aren't we? Dang. Okay. All right. I put my phone away so I wouldn't look at it. So you guys don't have questions. I'm worse than you, aren't I? I looked at my phone. No, it's because my doctor was supposed to call me between classes. Doctors, what are you going to do with them? All right. So here we go. Chapter 26. Chapter 26, wow, we're in page 1000 or something, but you know that your book doesn't have 1,000 pages. It's continued pages from the first half of the book. So the book starts with the chapter starts with the 70s. I think it starts with Nixon. I know that it starts with Nixon and then proceeds through Ronald Reagan. And what you see in this era is really a return to conservatism, or Republicans, if you like that. Now, during the earlier part of the Cold War, I don't know that you could really tell the difference in some ways between Democrats and Republicans, because they all seem to like to spend money on defense. They all seem to hate communism. Neither one of them are terribly consistent about civil rights. Did you notice that? As far as federal platform or program or what do you call it? That's just a platform. When the candidate for president is chosen at that same convention, they also create the party platform, which is supposed to be the list of stuff that the party supports. Well, the Democrats had included civil rights in their party platform since Harry Truman in 1948. But, truly, if you look at the Democrats, Harry Truman really was the civil rights program for a long time. And then there's nothing. And then LBJ. And then LBJ's records really mixed because of Vietnam. But LBJ is really when you start to see the change, because LBJ has got this very strong civil rights aspect to his presidency, but also has this really strange foreign policy with Vietnam that causes all sorts of problems and kind of pushes us a little bit away from a more militarized part of the Cold War. So in part, the end result might be good. I don't know how you would assess good and bad here, but it does get us to the point where we start to think, you know what, maybe sending troops overseas to fight about communism is kind of dumb, wasteful, dangerous, not good for the country that we're blowing up. We start to think a lot of things like that, plus bad for our own soldiers. So you'll start to see a change in foreign policy and a change in how we intervene in other countries once again, which is, it's pretty normal for us. And then a reminder at the beginning of the chapter that 68 is terrible. I really should have a quiz question about the only good thing that happens in 68, and that is birth of my brother, Jeff. Jeff is born in 68. Super nice guy. I tell him every time I see him, I always say, Jeff's the only good thing about 68. Martin Luther King Jr. gets assassinated. Robert Kennedy gets assassinated. The Tet Offensive occurs. Tet Offensive, I don't know if you noticed this in your reading, because I know you've got a lot of stuff to do, but our president, our military, press conferences, all this stuff, news, have been telling us we're winning the war. And it's just a matter of time. It's almost over. And we've got this plan of Americanization where we're sending US troops over to fight the war in Vietnam because there's nobody better than US troops. And I'm not arguing that at all. Believe me, I'm not arguing that. But, the thought is because our troops and our materiel are the best in the world, therefore we'll win the war really quickly if just American troops are fighting. So we send over 500,000 at the same time, which is pretty unusual. And so we know it's just a matter of time before it's over. And then because they have these live feed news cameras, they don't have 24-hour cable news networks, but they have live feed news cameras. We're able to get video of something that happens. It's called the Tet Offensive. And the civilian Vietnamese Communist Army, excuse me, decides that they are not going to take Tet off. Tet is a Vietnamese New Year celebration not terribly uncommon. Asian cultural celebration, probably different time each year, depending on the group. But Vietnamese New Year celebration. And typically people did a lot of fun things, drink and gamble and eat a lot. And they usually took about a week off. So for whatever reason, the civilian Vietnamese army decided they would not take the week off, and instead they invaded not invaded, they already lived there. They went into South Korean cities and just took over all of the major cities in, did I say Korea? Dang it. South Vietnam. They took over all the major cities in South Vietnam, and they did this over the holiday. And so we ended up with film of this happen, or video of this happening. And, we had been told that we were winning this war. And all we have to do is look on television and we can see video that suggests we are not winning this war. We're not winning this war. So when the Viet Cong, the civilian volunteers who didn't wear uniforms and stuff, took over the cities and we lost control of the cities. Now, if you look in military history, what you'll notice is this is technically a battle win for the South Vietnamese and US UN forces, because they eventually get all the territory back and they learn more stuff about the other side. But it's politically a loss for sure. And this is also when the news anchor, really famous news anchor, excuse me, Walter Cronkite says, it seems that America has lost this war. And then LBJ says something like, I know if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost America. So all of that kind of happens around the time when LBJ just says, I'm not running again. So Nixon kind of swoops in and he says, you know what? I'll go over there. I'll get us out. We'll win the war, but we'll have honor in how we leave. And I'll restore law and order in the United States, because people were tired of all the rioting and chaos. And so people said, law and order sounds good to me. Getting out of Vietnam sounds good to me. So let's go. All right. Did we lose that war? I'm going to go with a big yes on that. I don't know anybody that would argue anything any different. We are going to have a negotiated withdrawal. That's probably how they would refer to it at the time period. But I don't know anybody in retrospect who looks at the Vietnam conflict and says, nope, that went really well for us. Yeah. So I'm going to agree with your assessment. And I had a trio of uncles who fought in Vietnam, and they may or may not have agreed with that assessment, but they were certainly frustrated about how, and with good reason. We'll talk a little bit about all this stuff. Okay, I feel like I've gone over a bunch of that stuff already. So Nixon says I'm out, or we're out if you elect me, plus all this rioting, looting, foolishness that's going on is going to stop. And I know, are some of you thinking, we're kind of in the same spot politically in some ways. The rioting, looting, that kind of stuff, really, for a couple of reasons. People are protesting our involvement in Vietnam. That's turning to the point where it's less popular than more popular, because they drafted and sent over 500,000 people. Dang, that's a lot of people. And you draft and send over disproportionately poorer people, which also means they tend to be less white, because, statistics are what they are. So 500,000 people going to Vietnam, and then you've got civil rights leaders saying that this is also a racist policy because of who it affects, or it's at the very least detrimental to people in lower socioeconomic classes. And when Dr. King's assassinated, he's marching at a workers' strike. Yeah. So we've got anti-Vietnam protests. You also have civil rights stuff. And then you have reaction to these assassinations of a couple of major folks who are big on civil rights. So, yeah, anything that remotely goes. Yeah. And the rioting, I mean, you kind of have a new vision of that, probably because of the last year or so, because you certainly understand people's causes and why they're upset about things. And they were upset in '68 as well about police brutality and police declaring war on the Black Panthers and the Black Panthers declaring war on the police. And you may or may not agree in which order that happened. Officially, the Black Panthers declare war first, but the Black Panthers would argue there was an undeclared war, police versus African Americans before that. And tactics and things were much different then. I know about the current trial and stuff, but I mean, what you would see every day, everywhere, was, really completely unacceptable in some ways. And yeah, I know there are lots of people concerned that this sort of stuff will happen again. I'm barely old enough to remember 68. I promise you, I really don't remember it. I study it more as a historian. But we're talking National Guard in pretty much every major city. And several cities just looked like war zones with lockdowns and that sort of thing. I really don't think people in the United States would put up with that sort of restriction anymore. And plus I know we have pandemic plus civil rights and police issues, but they had Vietnam as well, which, involved 500,000 people being sent overseas and at least half of them thinking that shouldn't have happened. So I'm not saying it's more or less volatile. I don't know. I really don't know. That's definitely going to be a question for historians to compare. And yeah, I don't know. It's tricky stuff. All right, but the new Nixon's back. We end up electing him because honestly, we're just tired, probably. And the Democrats are really divided. So you've got the racist Democrat, you've got George Wallace running again for president, and you've got the pro-war Democrat that the party nominated, when it's very clear the younger members of their party are the most vocal and outspoken anti-war protesters. So Nixon's really kind of set up to win there, and he does. All right, and he said he would shift the focus of the fighting from Americanization to Vietnamization, and it's a word, I guess, if you say it is, to where we're going to withdraw American troops and put in, replace them with Vietnamese, with native troops. So, all right. So Vietnam, I think I've already said all this stuff. By 68, 500,000 US troops in country, disproportionate drafting of people who are poor, people of color, and those demographics tend to overlap. Led to protests, split in the Democratic Party, pro-war nominee who becomes their presidential nominee, anti-war nominee who's more popular but gets assassinated. LBJ says, I'm out. And Nixon, and I didn't even mention George Wallace in there, did I? The racist guy, the segregation now, segregation forever. And they've got, a really more obvious version of racism going on there in that time period. I don't know that obvious. We'll go with overt is probably the better word there. So 68 mess. And we already talked about the Tet Offensive, which is the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces taking over the major cities in South Vietnam during Tet, Vietnamese New Year. My Lai happens in 68, but we really don't get more information about it until 69 and 70 when somebody's prosecuted for it. It's a village in Vietnam, South Vietnam, where somebody in the village, a sniper in the village, had killed some American soldiers. The troops went into the village to try to find the sniper. By this time of the war, pretty much any Vietnamese village had really been cleared out. So all you had were old folks and women and kids. And so they searched and they couldn't find the sniper because everybody had been drafted. They had been forced into military service by either the North or the South, whoever came through and grabbed them. And, at this point, these guys are a bunch of, outside of the cities, they're typically a bunch of small farmers, and they really don't care which side wins. They just want the war to stop so they can go back to farming and being safe and not having landmines where they're trying to grow things. So the troops get frustrated because they can't find the sniper. They take everybody out, put them in a circle, and they kill the villagers. And this is reported, kind of overlooked. Eventually, somebody's prosecuted, but they're a mid-level non-commissioned officer rather than a higher ranking officer. People think that the military's kind of scapegoated that guy. He ends up getting convicted, but with time served, which is about 3 or 4 months. And then he goes on kind of a speaking tour in the United States because we are kind of in a mess during that time period as well. But My Lai really brings out that not everything that's going on in the war is noble and pure and about communism and people being evil and godless needing to be gotten rid of, because maybe it's just old people, women, and kids that we're getting rid of. And again, that's not the entire scope of the war. And I'm not trying to characterize the conflict as that, because there are legitimate concerns about certain communist parties and certainly dictatorships who also just kill people that disagree with them. I mean, because of my age and, when and where and how I studied history, I'm not going to be one of those history professors that says, communism, it really wasn't that bad. Communism as a theory is just a theory. It's fine. The dictators that endorsed and employed communism during this time period killed more people than World War II. So you can never argue, well, the way they implemented communism really was benign. It wasn't. How we decided to fight against communism also didn't achieve its purpose. Certainly not helpful, not effective, and caused more harm than good in a lot of situations. I think we could clearly conclude. But like everything in history, it's complicated. It's not all good and it's not all bad, except for Nazis. They're all bad. There are very few things in history. And don't anybody put in the chat anything about Nazis that are good. Don't do that. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. Okay. So the plan, Americanization was LBJ's plan, using American troops in Vietnam to use more modern weapons, get the war over with quickly. Not terribly effective for 100 reasons, or at least 10 or 12. The scale of the war, the limitations of the war, the purpose of the war, the training of the soldiers, and lots of stuff, where they were fighting, why they were fighting. So when Nixon comes in, he switches to a plan called Vietnamization, and he does kind of make that up. And that's to replace American troops, US troops. I know I should be saying United States instead of American, but US troops with South Vietnamese troops trained by the United States, and that'll achieve a US de-escalation of the war. That gets us out. And that's our main goal at this point, is to get the United States out of the war. Now, it'd be cool if we achieved whatever purposes and that South and North Vietnam would be united, which they will be, under capitalism, which they won't be, or democracy. We do tie the system of government and the system of economics together, of course. They do unite, but they have a communist government and economy. Nixon will use some unusual, unusual tactics to get the North Vietnamese to negotiate, because why would they want to negotiate? We've already said we're leaving, which means they're going to win, because no one else in the world is going to put in as much money, material, troops as we've put in. So we're just saying, like, hey, we're out pretty soon, so you're going to win. But we wanted to negotiate a surrender, and they said no reason to talk to you. So we started bombing the crap out of civilian targets, which is very, very controversial. North Vietnamese cities and villages, but also in Laos and Cambodia, the countries that aren't technically involved, but where primarily the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong are running supplies and troops. So these are border countries that the UN has said we need to stay out of, which is, I know I'd mentioned before, I had an uncle stationed in Laos, and it's also why his service record doesn't reflect that tour, because he wasn't technically there, because we weren't technically there. These actions are incredibly controversial, and you see lots of protests about these, especially in college campuses. And the two really famous protests are at Jackson State in Mississippi and Kent State, and I think This is 71. It's either 70 or 71. And we sent in the National Guard to both of these colleges because they're both state colleges. And I didn't mention Kent State was in Ohio. So the people in Ohio and the people in Mississippi are not okay with a bunch of looting, well, not looting, because you don't really loot a college campus, do you? Rioting and destruction. I mean, at Kent State, they burned down some buildings, the student protesters. So, I mean, this is not all, give peace a chance and rainbows and unicorns and people handing out flowers. They're burning down buildings as well. So the state government sends in the National Guard and they shoot students, and it's not their goal. Their goal is, well, I don't know what their goal is, do I? I know their goal is to get control of the college campuses, but a lot of times people join the National Guard during this time period. I don't want to say to get out of going to service in Vietnam, but I'll just say it out loud. It's not why everyone did it, but you got military training, but you got to stay at home and work your job. And then one weekend a month, they would call you up. And then of course you're on call for emergencies. So this National Guard service, they got on, called up for emergencies, and they're not super skilled at crowd control, police action, this sort of stuff. They're trained for war, and they end up shooting into crowds of protesters and people die. And this is also where I usually would pause until when I taught high school and say, like, here's the thing. When you go to college, if there's a riot on campus and they've called in the National Guard, that is a really good day to skip class. Really good day. No one get upset with you. All right, ceasefire with Vietnam is negotiated conveniently enough in an election year. So we've got peace and an honorable solution in Vietnam as the election's happening. Also Watergate as the election's happening. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the thought is, we got to reelect Nixon because he'll see this. Plus he runs against, who do you run against? Not Hubert Humphrey, the guy from, why can I not think of this? I'm clearly not asking it on the quiz, am I? It was Edmund Muskie, but then he ends up going to a mental health institution, which, you need to do that sometimes. McGovern, George McGovern. I couldn't think of it. Sorry. All I can think of is he's from a Dakota or something. Nobody lives there. All right. So Nixon gets reelected, and then some stuff's going to go down. All right. Let's talk about some stuff that happens during the Nixon administration that almost everybody thinks is good, because it's really easy. I really should have asked what's good and bad about Nixon. Would have been a more fun question, probably. But most people know, the only thing they know about Nixon is Watergate. And then they don't know what that is. I would always have students like, why did Richard Nixon rob a hotel? It's like, why do you think he robbed a hotel? And then, dang it, it's Forrest Gump, isn't it? Forrest Gump is the reason you think Nixon robbed a hotel. That is not what happened. But we'll talk about Watergate in a minute. I know that it's on there. It needs to be. Okay. So Nixon, we got to get through Nixon so we can get to Ford and Carter, which will take about 2 minutes, probably next time. And then most of the class will be about Reagan. But Nixon's it's full. So things we like about Nixon. Most people think his foreign policy is really good. I remember, you go like, yeah, this old person story. When Nixon died, and I think it was around 1990, I don't really remember, it was in the 1990s. And I'm watching his funeral on television because I'm a history nerd and that's what we do. And they have a really famous historian commentating on his funeral, a guy named David McCullough, who wrote the John Adams biography in 1776. And he's really good, really excellent writer as well. But anyway, David McCullough, and he's just beside himself. It's like, I don't understand why we're talking about Nixon as a hero, because Nixon is, he's Watergate, he's all these other things. And, here we are acting like he was the greatest elder statesman in our history. foreign policy is probably the main reason. Plus, we do tend to forgive people, and he was like 90. So, but we do tend to forgive people. So, détente, foreign policy, there were some things that we liked about this. Détente is a French word that means détente. I don't know what it means. It means negotiation, it means talking to you. So, what you see in the Nixon administration is a move away from threatening to blow the crap out of you with all of our nuclear weapons to negotiating with you. It's not quite that simple, but it's a little different as well. So what we're negotiating, let me just go through the stuff. So negotiation with foreign countries rather than mutually assured destruction or massive retaliation. Now, whether he believes this is the best path or not, I think that he did, but it doesn't matter. It's certainly what he argued. It's practical, it's cheaper, it's less dangerous. We don't send as many troops overseas, it's less destructive. So it's much more of a practical foreign policy philosophy. So the US policy of threat and intimidation leads to a nuclear arms race that's really expensive and dangerous. I mean, at any moment, if we're not as worried about a nut getting control of the United States and launching nuclear weapons. I don't know if any of you worry about stuff like that with either, because I know politically you're not like me. You either really like Biden and really despise Trump, or you really liked Trump and you really despise Biden, and you think whichever one is completely incompetent and could get us all killed. I know I had a lot of friends that thought at any moment Donald Trump was going to launch nuclear weapons and destroy the earth. It's like, that's not how that works. No matter how many movies you see, he doesn't just have some buttons in the office and go like, hey, let's nuke somebody today. That's not how it works. So, I mean, there's so many fail safes in our system in spite of movies and things that you've seen that it's pretty unlikely, except for Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis. It's pretty unlikely in the modern era because of some checks and balances we put in that system that something like that could happen without it going through several different channels. I am not saying that there can't be people appointed to those positions that always agree with the president and maybe don't give him good advice. That could happen, but you would like to think that somewhere in the bureaucracy and the appointed offices that somebody with some sense will go like, hey, destroying the world's a bad idea, okay? So we've kind of come to that conclusion, especially after Cuban Missile Crisis. And Nixon said, it's just time to talk. Yeah, plus we spend less money and there's no reason for us to threaten to kill each other. Plus the Soviet Union is starting to have some economic issues and they don't want to spend that much money anyway. Yeah, I think too, I think there's wisdom in your comment, Aaron. I think we should be more, if you want to be nervous about stuff, and I would try not to be because you don't control very much stuff anyway. No offense, but yeah, you can't worry about stuff you can't fix. And you try to fix the stuff you can. That's my simple philosophy of life. I think we have to be more worried about rogue nations or, nations that have unusual leaders and not so many checks and balances where, maybe they envision that their leadership is supposed to bring the end of the world as we know it. And occasionally you do have a guy in North Korea or Iran that has those sorts of beliefs. Yeah, those guys, they make me a little nervous. China, they're too fat and happy to want to blow stuff up, and we are as well. And Russia might blow up their neighborhood, but they're not going to blow up the whole world in the modern era. In this era, they weren't blowing up anybody because, yeah, they were also fat and happy. Regionally, they are now. So a country that's kind of fat and happy, they usually don't want to, destroy stuff. All right. Anyway, angry country where they don't have dinner every night, like North Korea, country where they have unusual religious beliefs that they think are supposed to usher in the end of the world, and not the whole country, but the leader, of course. Yeah, that's dangerous stuff. Nixon's none of those things. So he says, the Cold War is what it is. Let's just manage it. The Soviet Union's not going to destroy us. We're not going to destroy them. We got to find place where we can get along and cooperate with each other and de-escalate the stuff. So that's the plan, and you start to see that. Yeah. Yeah, nuclear missile. Yes, that's not ever good, is it? Yeah, and if you're in the military, you may have a whole different view on this. I know our pastor at our church, not talking religion, don't get upset. Before he was a preacher, he was in the military, and in his job position, he carried the nuclear launch code. So he was the kind of bureaucratic version of, do I push the button now sort of thing. There's so many levels of that. And he's one of the most reasonable, rational people that I've ever met. And my thought was, well, this is good to know that that's who they intentionally put in charge of stuff like that. But anyway, all right, back to business. So sorry. So Nixon administration wants to negotiate. So they start talking to people we've never talked to, like the leader of the Soviet Union. We are negotiating with North Vietnam. We're trying to get Egypt and Israel to stop blowing the crap out of each other, which was kind of a problem during this era because of ethnicity, religion, and oil. It's kind of a trifecta there. We're going to go to the Soviet Union. We're going to go to China. Our thought is too, if we get China and the Soviet Union to distrust each other and not work together, that's better for the entire world. And, there's still people that have that kind of philosophy. And I have no idea if that's good or bad. That's up to you. So we want to get the communist nations to distrust each other, and that'll cause both of them to soften toward the US and be more suspicious of each other. Plus, groundbreaking, really important strategic arms limitation talks, and we end up signing a treaty, the SALT Treaty, to limit the production of ICBMs, which if you were from my era, everyone would know what those were, intercontinental ballistic missiles, because we were all sure we were going to get nuked and die. I don't know what young people's fear is now, but those of us that grew up in the 70s, we were just sure we were going to get nuked and die. So Ivy Mikes. I have no idea what you're talking about. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Is Ivy Mike something you're scared of? Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about climate change. I know when I taught high school, if I didn't recycle something, those kids could be cheating, they could be talking bad about each other online. They could be doing all kinds of stuff that I thought was terrible. But if I threw a piece of paper away and didn't put it in the recycle bin, class had to stop. I mean, it was pretty serious stuff. So, but the good thing about that was it certainly got, and an Ivy Mike is a type of nuke? How do I not know? Well, because I'm not in the military and I'm a stereotype of a female historian. Yeah, military history is definitely not my thing. But the intercontinental ballistic missiles are the ones we, send over in the middle of the night and nuke each other with. And so we're going to start limiting the production of those things. If you look through our history of, nobody needs that. Yeah. I know we have those, and I'm sure there's a reason we have those, but oh gosh, no, we don't need, yeah, okay. All right. I can remember when I was in high school and the Marines were recruiting me pretty hard. Test scores looked really good. And I told them, if you knew me, you wouldn't even talk to me. Like, you don't want me protecting the world and making us safe for democracy because, it wouldn't go well. But the reason that this is kind of groundbreaking and historic is if you look at the history of treaties where we do arms limitations, we usually limit stuff we weren't going to build more of anyway. Like if you look in the 20s and you see the 5 and 9 power naval treaties where we're limiting the number of battleships that we're going to build, we limited the number of obsolete battleships. I mean, anytime we limit stuff, it's usually stuff we didn't intend to build anyway. And these were, up to date, newest, really, the stuff we would use if we were going to use it on each other. So this turns out to be really important stuff. This is big, groundbreaking stuff. It really is. And more stuff about Nixon. New federalism, this probably isn't going to be in the category of stuff that you think is great, but this is stuff that you definitely see in the modern era, and it's very Southern as well. And it's a little Midwestern as well. But the idea that the federal government really can't take care of New Deal type programs or welfare type programs as well as the states could because there's too much bureaucracy. Anything that the federal government does is, they waste more dollars than they spend. So the local government or private industry can do these things better. And that's a very kind of common modern, maybe libertarian, perhaps Midwestern Southern sort of thing. And it was really starting to be part of the Republican Party during this time period. So the thought was if we shift the programs from being administered, still federally funded, but administered at the state level, we can cut the budget and still be equally as effective. So they're going to cut the budget a lot. And if they're equally as effective, that's, you would have to look at statistics to judge that. But lots of statistics too, because our economy is changing during this era as well. When our economy is getting worse, we're also cutting money to social programs. And I know some of you who are more, some of you are thinking, well, no, that makes sense. We have less money to spend. And then others of you are thinking, oh, that's terrible because we have more people in need. And it's both are probably true, but it leads to really large budget cuts and locally or state administered programs. And if your state's kind of on the ball and has things together and is good at administering large programs, that's probably okay. If it's not, it's probably terrible. And I think we saw maybe our own version of this with the vaccine rollout, where some states have done a really good job, other states have done a really poor job, and other states don't seem to have done any job at all. So, and I think Texas were probably somewhere in the middle toward the pretty good job idea. Probably depends on your city, that sort of stuff. If there's a racetrack or a stadium nearby, they probably did a good job. I know I got mine at a football stadium, so there you go. Nixon creates, I'm making up words, just like Nixon. Nixon creates the Environmental Protection Agency during his administration. I know you're going, no, he didn't. Yes, he did. You would look this one up. So that happens during his administration. And we find out a lot of stuff in the 70s that's really bad. Really, really bad. I know we do Earth Day and we plant trees and stuff like that. But we also find out that in the development of nuclear weapons, there's some waste products that are created there, and those are not good waste products. We may have dumped some of those things in the river, or not the river, but in a river, or buried some of them in the desert, or maybe in Pennsylvania near some cities. So we are going to find a whole bunch of nuclear waste and other federal dump sites, and we'll create the Superfund to clean that stuff up, and it's going to take forever. It takes, a couple of decades. And then there's, of course, with the nuclear stuff, well, the other stuff as well. There's all sorts of environmental issues that continue because of that. And that's where you get those Aaron Brockovich kind of movies. And from this era, that's when we do a lot of that cleanup. And I grew up in an area of the country where there's a lot of bad stuff in the water and a lot of bad stuff in the soil. And pretty much everyone from my generation of my family has some really weird illness that's hard to treat and chronic and that kind of stuff that our parents didn't have. And I think it's because stuff was added to the environment in the 60s and 70s when we grew up. And then, of course, they were cleaning it up when we were in high school. And they might have been cleaning it up literally when we were in high school. So tearing the asbestos out of the buildings while we were in the buildings, breathing in the asbestos. So yeah, my generation, we're puny and it's not completely our fault. Yeah, okay. All right, but there's a good need for the EPA, and they'll also start creating mileage standards for cars. Before this, if your car got 10 miles to the gallon, we just didn't care because your car was cool and gas was cheap. Things are going to change in this era for really more economic reasons and environmental reasons, but the impact will be good for both. So cars will get lighter. We won't make them of steel as much anymore. It'll improve their gas mileage rates. And we'll also start conserving energy more, can also tell people from my generation, because every time we leave a room, we turn off the light. So, I mean, we were kind of trained to turn off the light, shut the door, wear a sweater. That was Jimmy Carter told us to wear a sweater instead of turning the heat up, that sort of thing. We also were taught in our science classes that a global ice age was about to happen. So that's why also if you hear people skeptical in my generation, like, why are they talking about this global warming thing? I understand that it's climate change. I understand. You don't have to yell at me. But yeah, because first it was global cooling, then it's global warming. Scientists, they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. So we were kind of told to prepare for the next ice age, which maybe was a little overdone, maybe a little, but you know, they did see climate changing, and I think weren't exactly sure how to assess it. So, all right, Title IX and affirmative action. Yes, those things come in the Nixon administration as well. And you're going like, those are cool things, or I don't know what those things are. And I would not have associated them with Nixon if you thought they were cool. Let me remind you of what they are or tell you. So Title IX equalizes spending on women's sports and other programs in high school and college. So before this, women didn't play very many sports because there was no money for it, because the federal funds, and then of course the state funds eventually, were only spent on men's sports. So there were really good baseball programs, basketball programs, and football programs for men, and really essentially nothing for women. So this will equalize spending on that. I'm going to see that. Okay. I really don't need you asking me questions about the environment because I'm a history teacher. But all that stuff is cyclical. I'm certain of that. And I'm certain you're right about evaporation. And yeah, no, because there's cycles in everything. And we see that living in Central Texas as well, on a micro scale, perhaps, where we have like 5 years where it just doesn't rain at all, and then 5 years where it doesn't stop raining. So we either have drought or flood, Lake Travis is overfull or it's empty, that sort of thing. And yeah, climate goes through cycles the same way everything else goes through cycles. And yes, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm just going to say that that's not my level or area field of expertise. Um, it's right up there with military history, but I promise I do know some stuff about history. But yeah, I think too that they probably, because you know, we learned this in public school, and I'm not trying to disrespect any public school teachers because I was one. You know, the job of a public school teacher is not always academic. It's sometimes to keep you guys from being stupid. It's to help socialize you. You know, there's a lot of stuff. So the academic qualifications of someone to discuss climate change in third grade are necessarily low because that's not, you know, their main job. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. No, I think in the modern era, especially people younger than 40, have come to accept that if we don't take better care of the environment, that the consequences are going to be, you know, to the point that we can't absorb the consequences. Whether you think that'll happen in 10 years or 20 or 100, I think in the modern era, there aren't very many people under 40 who think we shouldn't take care of the environment. And I think I think the EPA may be the beginning of creating national policy that helps. Well, I know this. It's the beginning of creating national policy to take better care of the environment, to clean up what was a mess. Like where my family lives, where I went to visit my dad near Cleveland, they have the Cuyahoga River, which is a pretty big river that runs through a lot of Ohio. And it used to regularly catch on fire because it was so polluted. It does not do that anymore because they've cleaned it up, in part because of the EPA and other environmental regulations. So I know, you know, your age folks may get discouraged about this, and understandably, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I would say if you look at the environment pre-EPA and post-EPA, you'll see a dramatic difference. And I think you also see a dramatic difference in our country and in the developed European countries versus the more, I don't know if developing is an okay thing to say, but China and India, which are just starting to or kind of completing their industrial revolution round two. And their major, I know their population's huge as well, but their pollution standards are not near what ours are. And I know when I've very rarely visited foreign countries in the Western Hemisphere, exception being Canada, of course, their emphasis on environmental protection isn't as strong either. So I know you get discouraged, but I promise you we're headed in the right direction. You don't have to believe me, of course, but if you look at some historical recollections, maybe you'll feel a little better. Title IX, did we talk about that? So women getting more, do you not care about women getting to play softball? But yeah, more money for college sports. This also creates scholarships and things like that for women's athletics and more programs for them to compete. Probably the beginning of women's professional sports, which I know lag behind men's professional sports. And I also know it's a business, so if people don't want to go see it, you can't make them go. I get all that. So that's a combination of stuff. And then affirmative action, this happens during the Nixon administration. It's a push to equalize hiring practices and college admission based on race. And I know this can be controversial. It's always controversial. It's really designed to correct a historic wrong, which, I mean, there were certain colleges that just wouldn't let you in if you weren't white or wouldn't let you in if you were female. And you start to see changes in that. I know you see them before this time period, but this allows the federal government to be more active in correcting those problems. So, but affirmative action will set quotas, and that's going to end up being more controversial. We'll talk about that later because the Supreme Court's not as okay with quotas as it is with the general idea of equality in college admission and hiring. So the difference is, if you're wondering, if there is a quota system, let's say you all wanted to go to UT. So they just look at the demographics of Texas, and I don't know the exact demographics, but we'll just go with this for my analogy. We'll say that there 30% of Texans are Hispanic in origin, that 10% are Black in origin, 10% are Asian, and then 50% are white. It's probably not quite right, but we'll just go with that. So then for every 10 students, they would have to let in 5 white students, 1 Black, 1 Asian, and 3 Hispanic students. And then ideally, the mix of those would be, 5 women and 5 men, or 6 women and 4 men, but it would match the percentages of people within the population. And what the Supreme Court will eventually rule is those strict numbers have to be let go. The idea of diversity needs to be enforced. The strict numbers shouldn't. And that's when they went to the top 10 or top 6 or whatever percent it is now that you get automatic admission to certain systems, UT, A&M, or tech systems. And then, of course, that could mean you're going to UT San Antonio. I don't know. All right. And there's certainly lots more cases about this that go to the Supreme Court, and it's tricky stuff. And then I think the most recent one was at Harvard, and I think the Supreme Court maybe declined to hear it, where Asian students sued because they said Harvard discriminated against them by race, which was interesting as well. And they made enough of a case that they got all the way to, through the appellate courts. So discrimination, tricky stuff. But affirmative action set quotas in hiring and college admission. And so those aren't exactly legal anymore, but there are versions of them that we still kind of look at. Crud, we're running out of time, so I may have to do Watergate next time, but we can do a quick version of it maybe. Well, we'll see. So Spiro Agnew is Nixon's vice president, who apparently doesn't always pay his taxes and occasionally accepts a bribe. These are bad things when you're vice president. They're probably bad things when you're not vice president, but people noticed, so they had to get rid of him. And when you have to get rid of your vice president, then you pick a new one, and the Senate has to confirm them, sort of like a cabinet member, somebody like that. So he picked a guy named Gerald Ford that everybody liked. I think everybody likes to describe him as affable. So I put that word in there, like it just means everybody likes him. So Ford's just a good guy and everybody respects him and likes him. And he's kind of a moderate Republican. So he's kind of middle of the road. Nixon had been a more conservative one, but then behaved as a more moderate one in some ways, in other ways, not as much. But so we got Ford and Nixon for round two. Now, when Nixon ran for president in 72, Nixon's kind of a nervous dude. So he sort of spies on people a little, not really spies on people, but he records conversations and has transcripts made of every conversation in the Oval Office, whether it's on the phone or in person. So he's got the phones and the Oval Office back. So he is a little bit of a nervous person, and he's running against this McGovern fellow who's from Dakota, and nobody lives there. And the chances he's going to lose to McGovern are pretty small. But Nixon's nervous, and he hasn't always done well in elections, as we know. So his people, not necessarily him, he doesn't say like, hey, go do this, but he does, similar kind of sketchy things. So they didn't feel like this would be out of character for the Nixon administration to be okay with this. His committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP, decide that they will break into the Democratic National Headquarters, DNC, Democratic National Committee headquarters, which are housed at the Watergate Hotel and Office Complex. They broke into the office side, not the room next to Forrest Gump's at the hotel. But they break into the office complex and they get caught. And when they get caught, they don't have any ID on them or anything like that. But one of them has a little flip notebook, and he has some phone numbers in there. And the police call some of those phone numbers and they go to the White House switchboard. And this is during an election year. It sort of comes out a little, but it's toward the end, and Nixon's going to win anyway. And the news about negotiating a peace settlement in Vietnam is much bigger news than this potential break-in that might have been related to the campaign, but probably wasn't directly. So it doesn't make that much of a splash during the campaign. The goal was to go in and take pictures of the files. They had, physical files because it's early, so no computers. For the campaign strategy, so Nixon would have this stuff. Now, Nixon doesn't participate in this. He didn't plan it. He didn't direct it. It wasn't his idea. However, he does find out about it. And rather than turning his people in, he decides to use the federal government to help cover it up. So they sort of conceal evidence. They fire the special prosecutor who's looking into this, and then the second special prosecutor is every bit as vigilant, so they can't really fire him. But they do tax audits on people, FBI investigations on people. They fire a whole bunch of people on the same day. They call it the Saturday Night Massacre, but no one actually gets killed. But they do a lot of illegal things using the power of the federal government to harass people who are investigating Watergate. So when all of this starts to come out in the congressional investigation, which is in large part led by Barbara Jordan, who's a Texas congressperson, and there's a statue of her at the airport, right by the where you pick up your luggage. Yeah. So anyway, Barbara Jordan leads these. So is one of the leaders of these investigations. And what we eventually find out that Nixon taped all the conversations. They ask him for some of the conversations and transcripts from when they discover the Watergate break-in. He says he doesn't have to turn those over because of national security. The Supreme Court disagrees with him. He sends tapes where I think it's 18 minutes of the tapes are erased. And the secretary says, that was my fault. I accidentally erased them. No one believes it. So he ends up getting impeached, and but not convicted. And he doesn't actually, they don't finish the impeachment. So they start the impeachment process. And so the House says, yeah, we want to put him on trial. And then these senators, the Republican senators, have a meeting with Nixon. They say, hey, Nixon, We just need you to know this is not going to go well for you. And at the very least, we're going to kick you out of office. I know it's a 3-minute warning. I don't even need to look. So at the very least, we're going to kick you out of office. And Nixon says, I will. And they said, you should probably resign. And he says, I will never resign. And then he resigns. He resigns. Yeah. So impeachment's the result of Nixon's administration cover-up of the break-in, which include IRS audits, FBI investigations of people involved in the investigation. In addition to the destruction of evidence, Nixon used the power of the federal government to cover up his administration's involvement. I feel like there should be an apostrophe there, so sorry, in the break-in. Now, the first thing that the new president, Ford, remember the appointed vice president that everybody likes, the very first thing he does is pardon Nixon. And people were hot about that because we really, really, really wanted Nixon to go to jail because other people went to jail. This seemed like a crime. We're tired of our government lying to us. We had LBJ's administration lying about Vietnam. Then we had the Pentagon Papers come out, the beginning of the Nixon administration, which was more about the government lying to us about Vietnam. And it wasn't Nixon's government, but it comes out during Nixon's administration. Then we've got Watergate, and it's like, dang, we can't trust any of these people. Someone's got to go to jail. So we wanted Nixon to go to jail, and Ford pardoned. What the heck, Ford? Now, looking back on this historically, it's probably like, no, we probably needed to de-escalate some stuff because we were a little keyed up. But so historically, probably that was a good thing. At the time, I guarantee you, most people thought it was not great. Now, Nixon still had some popularity, of course, because he'd won that second election by a landslide. But, you know, when Watergate came out and then when Vietnam ended and it didn't look quite as honorable as we thought maybe it would be, and we officially lost, as you guys had mentioned, it's really the first war that we've lost. So it was like, oh gosh, our country's crappy and we feel bad about it and our president should go to jail. And I think in that way, that kind of feeling was pretty similar to maybe what we saw early this year without the pandemic. Although there are going to be some fairly interesting medical issues that arise during this era that we'll probably talk about a little bit next time. A little bit. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.